Sarah and her three friends, Mike, Jessica, and Ethan, decide to go on a camping trip in the dense, remote forests of the Pacific Northwest. The area is known for its breathtaking beauty and isolation, with miles of untamed wilderness. They find a secluded spot near a crystal-clear lake, setting up their tents and gathering around a campfire. The first night is peaceful, filled with laughter and ghost stories, but as darkness falls, an eerie silence descends on the forest, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. The next morning, they wake to find odd signs around their campsite. Mike's tent, which was securely zipped up the night before, is slightly open and some of their food supplies are missing. They joke about a raccoon raid and brush it off, but Sarah feels uneasy, as if they're being watched. Throughout the day, they notice more unsettling details. Footprints in the mud that don't match any of their shoes, and strange carvings on the trees nearby that look fresh. That night, the noises return, louder, closer. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Something is moving just beyond the firelight. Ethan, trying to be brave, calls out, but there's no response. When they check in the morning, they find their gear scattered and deep claw marks gouged into the trees around their camp. Jessica insists they leave, but Mike convinces them to stay, arguing that it's just wild animals. On the third night, the terror escalates. As they sit around the fire, they begin to hear whispers carried on the wind, faint, unintelligible words that seem to come from all directions. The fire suddenly goes out, plunging them into darkness. They scramble to relight it, and in the brief flashes of light from the matches, they catch glimpses of a figure standing just beyond the trees, a tall, emaciated man with wild eyes and a crazed grin. Panicked, they grab their flashlights and shine them into the woods, but the figure is gone. They decide to leave immediately, but as they pack up, they realize that their car keys are missing. Desperate and terrified, they start down the trail on foot, but the path they took to the campsite seems to have changed. The trees close in around them, the forest growing denser with every step. Hours pass, and they're still lost, their flashlights growing dimmer. That's when they hear it, the sound of footsteps behind them, heavy and deliberate. They break into a run, but the footsteps keep pace, getting closer and closer. Suddenly, Mike trips and falls, and as he looks up, the man is standing over him, grinning wildly. The others scream and bolt, but the man doesn't chase them. He simply stands there, watching as they disappear into the trees. The next morning, only Sarah makes it out of the forest, disheveled and traumatized. She's found by a search party, babbling about the man in the woods. When the authorities return to the campsite, they find it abandoned, with no trace of Mike, Jessica, or Ethan. The locals tell her she's lucky to be alive. The forest has always had a reputation, they say, for claiming those who venture too deep. They never find the man, and Sarah is left with a haunting memory of his face, knowing he's still out there, waiting for his next victims. When Tom, a middle-aged man, inherits a decrepit old house from a distant relative, he's initially reluctant to take on the burden. The house, located in a remote countryside village, has been in his family for generations, though no one has lived there for decades. He decides to restore it, hoping to eventually sell it off for a profit. The locals in the village, however, seem wary when he mentions the house. They exchange knowing glances and warn him of strange happenings, but Tom dismisses their superstitions as rural folklore. As he begins renovations, Tom spends most of his time in the basement, a dark, musty space filled with cobwebs and forgotten relics. While clearing out old furniture, he notices something odd, a shadow on the wall that doesn't correspond to any object in the room. At first, it seems to be a trick of the light, but the shadow behaves strangely, moving when Tom moves, but always a split second out of sync. It mimics his actions, but there's a sinister edge to its movements, as if it's trying to break free from the wall. Over the next few days, the shadow grows more aggressive. It begins to distort, its form stretching and shifting into grotesque shapes. Sometimes it seems to be reaching for him, its fingers elongating into claws that scrape along the wall. Tom tries to avoid the basement, but the shadow starts to appear in other parts of the house, on the stairs, in the kitchen, even in his bedroom. No matter where he goes, it follows, always one step behind. Tom decides to investigate the house's history and uncovers a chilling tale. The house was once owned by a man named Elias, a reclusive artist who became obsessed with capturing the essence of life in his paintings. He dabbled in dark rituals, believing he could trap the soul of a living being in his artwork. Elias vanished under mysterious circumstances, and his unfinished masterpiece was left behind, a canvas depicting a shadowy figure that seemed almost alive. Tom realizes with horror that the shadow is Elias, or at least what's left of him. The ritual went horribly wrong, and Elias's soul became trapped in the walls of the house, doomed to haunt it for eternity. The more Tom tries to ignore the shadow, the more powerful it becomes, feeding off his fear. On the final night, the shadow breaks free from the wall, no longer a mere reflection, but a living, breathing entity. Tom attempts to flee, but the shadow overtakes him, dragging him into the darkness, where his screams are swallowed by the void. After a difficult breakup, Emily, a young woman in her late 20s, moves into a new apartment on the outskirts of town, eager for a fresh start. The building is old but charming, with a history stretching back over a century. The landlord, an elderly man with a frail demeanor, seemed eager to rent it out, but there was something unsettling in the way he mentioned that the last tenant left in a hurry. Within a week of moving in, Emily begins receiving strange phone calls. At first, they seem like harmless prank calls. Each one comes exactly at midnight. When she answers, there's only silence on the other end, occasionally punctuated by faint, labored breathing. She dismisses it as some local kids messing around, but as the nights go on, the calls become more disturbing. The caller begins to speak, whispering her name and recounting details of her daily life that no one else should know. He mentions the groceries she bought earlier that day, the exact outfit she wore, and even the private thoughts she had while standing in front of her bathroom mirror. Emily becomes increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone is watching her every move. She changes her phone number, hoping to put an end to the torment, but the calls persist, always from an unknown number. She goes to the police, but they are unable to trace the calls. One night, as the phone rings at midnight, she decides to let it go to voicemail, but what she hears chills her to the bone. It's her own voice, pleading for help. Desperate, she contacts the landlord to ask about the previous tenant. His reluctance to talk is palpable, but after some coaxing, he reveals that the former tenant was a young woman who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The last time anyone heard from her was a phone call she made to her sister, crying about a man who was stalking her. The police found no signs of foul play, and the case went cold. Emily digs deeper into the apartment's history and discovers that several women have lived there over the years, each one leaving suddenly or disappearing entirely. The most chilling discovery is that the phone number making the calls has been disconnected for decades. Terrified, Emily decides to leave the apartment, but on her final night, as she packs her bags, the phone rings again. This time, the voice on the other end isn't her own, but that of the missing tenant, begging Emily not to leave her behind.